Lover's Moon, a novel by Mark Leslie and Julie Strauss. Read by the authors. Saturday, May 21st, 2011. Chapter 1. Michael. 11:52 a.m. The scent was beyond intoxicating. It was so compelling, in fact, that I could almost feel myself getting turned on. And I hadn't even seen her yet. The fragrance of basil, oregano, rosemary, and thyme, mixed with garlic, permeated the air. Antonio's urban kitchen was the kind of place that would make you hungry regardless of your condition when you walked in. You could have just come from either a marathon session at an all-you-can-eat buffet or finishing a winning run at Nathan's annual hot dog eating contest on Coney Island and still find yourself suddenly overwhelmed with hunger pangs. And while the food here was amazingly delicious, the smell of the place was out of this world. Because I was still in the tail end of my monthly cycle, where after sunset I morphed into my wolfish alter ego, the effect of the delicious smells was that much more intense. Even at the lowest time in the moon phase cycle, when my canine enhanced abilities were at their weakest, they were still at least 2 to 3 times more sensitive than our normal humans. Particularly since I realized I hadn't had anything to eat since that stale muffin I'd crammed into my mouth with that morning's coffee. It was normal for me to skip meals and forget to eat when I was in the middle of a writing deadline, which was exactly where I'd been. The only time I typically paused to eat in the midst of a writing crunch was during the cycle of a full moon. I suppose that had something to do with the energy required in the metamorphosis of my human body from a 6'2" 200-pound human into a 150-pound, 6-foot-long gray wolf, and then back again. I can only imagine the number of calories such a transmogrification requires from a person, not to mention the calories I likely burn when I'm tearing around Central Park all night on 4 legs. No, let me correct that. I don't really need to imagine the effect it has. I know it intimately. When I'm going through that time of the month, I'm ravenous, and I never should have considered going as long as I had today without eating. I had to consciously force my mouth closed to keep my tongue from hanging out because the canine instinct inside me was strong with wanting to see if I could pick up more of the flavor from the similarly enhanced taste buds there. But the smell of the place reminded me of just how incredible their food was, and it made me glad we agreed to meet here. As I said, I hadn't seen her yet, and I didn't know what she looked like. I had only spoken to her on the phone when we made this date, so I didn't have a scent to go on. And with my senses muted and the poor quality of the phone connection we'd had, I hadn't picked up on her heartbeat. So I wouldn't be able to use that to single her out from among the patrons. Standing in the front entrance and waiting for the maitre d', I took in the scene. There were about 20 tables. Half of them were larger, with seating for 4 to 6 people at them, so I could rule those out. There were a few 2-seater tables with pairs at them. Those were eliminated too. Only 4 tables had a single person at them, and only 2 of them were women. One was an elderly woman I placed in her mid-60s, sitting at a table for 2, wearing a stylish dark blue jacket, red, horn-rimmed glasses, with a long silver hair tied up in a bun at the back of her head. She was attractive, with a face that reminded me of Jessica Lange, particularly how she had looked in the promo photos for that new television show, American Horror Story. She also looked sharp as a handful of tacks, with an aura that didn't just say librarian, it screamed it in a way that would register an army of hushes from library workers across America. And don't get me started on my lifelong immediate attraction to female librarians, or, heck, any woman who spent a significant amount of time with her nose in a book. If she was Beatrice, the woman I had spoken to on the phone last night to set up this lunch date, I knew I would likely be in for a stimulating conversation with a woman who was easy on the eye. Yep, easy on the eye and deep, meaningful conversation. The kind of afternoon that would last forever. Exactly what I needed in my life. But not now, of course, because I was on a tight deadline for my latest novel. And this wasn't a date, it was a business meeting, an arranged lunch meeting to acquire information on the occult as part of the research for my novel, Tome of Terror. What the heck was wrong with me? I mean, apart from the fact that for a full week every month I spent the nights naked, walking around on all fours, drooling and howling at the moon, and apart from the fact that I hadn't had a significant relationship in more than 10 years. I wasn't here to spend the afternoon whining and dining a handsome woman whose conversation I could predict would be as stimulating as her physical appeal. I was here to get work done, gather information, eat a delicious meal, make notes, and get back to my apartment and write all afternoon before the inevitable sunset metamorphosis. Okay, so perhaps this lunch date was with her. I figured it would be an informative and entertaining afternoon, and it wouldn't hurt if I lingered a little longer for some enjoyable conversation and human interaction. What would an extra hour or so really set me back? I turned my gaze from the Jessica Lange librarian and down several tables to the other single woman at the two-seater table further down that row, and my heart leaped into my throat. A stunning brunette in her mid-20s with a short pixie-style cut that brilliantly framed her gorgeous face, with pronounced rounded cheekbones and captivating blue eyes, was staring intently at me. It was the type of look any heterosexual man could feel in his hip pocket, and it had pretty much that effect on me as our eyes locked. I shifted uncomfortably, and she smiled and nodded, mouthing my name. Michael. Even without being able to smell her over the powerful scent of the food at Antonio's or hear her distinct heartbeat or the silently mouthed word, there was no doubt that she was my date, the woman I'd spoken to on the phone. I grinned and mouthed her name. Beatrice? She nodded and smiled again, and her eyes lit up in a way that made her even more beautiful, if that was possible. I felt my mouth pulling into what must have looked like an idiotic shit-eating grin. The maitre d' arrived, walking in front of me and cutting her off from my view. It had the effect of temporarily breaking the spell Beatrice Look had on me. I actually gave my head a quick shake. "Good afternoon, sir," he smiled, clasping his hands in front of him. He had a slight French accent, a bit off-brand for an Italian restaurant, and the way he looked and stood reminded me of Eric Idle in the role of Gaston, the French waiter in Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, right down to the thick cowlick and mustache. The juxtaposition of the British look and French sound reminded me of the opposite of something that had always bothered me about Captain Jean-Luc Picard on Star Trek The Next Generation. Patrick Stewart, a brilliant actor, was supposed to be playing a man born in France, yet he spoke with a UK English dialect and exuded typical British behavior and habits. "Is Monsieur here with a reservation this afternoon?" he asked, clinching the nickname I'd already immediately assigned him in my head. This Jean-Luc Idle character was close enough that I could pick up on a whiff of smugness and acknowledgement that he knew exactly what I had been transfixed by when he arrived. I stammered, "I have a reservation. It's, under the name Andrews." "Ah, yes, very good. Your lovely, young dinner companion has arrived and is seated at your table." He sprinkled just a slight bit of extra weight onto the word young as he spoke, subtly calling out the difference in our ages. His eyes flitted lightning quick to the slight, still retracting bulge in my pants that Beatrice's gaze had inspired, and I caught an additional scent of that knowing smugness. "I trust you have already seen that, though, yes?" I nodded slowly, and I'm sure my mouth might have also been hanging open. This guy was good, perfectly polite and respectful in all manners, and yet brilliantly subtle in his condescension towards me. "Very good. Come with me, right this way, monsieur." He beckoned me to follow, which I did. As Beatrice came back into sight, her eyes were again fixed on me. They pulled me in like a sci-fi tractor beam from the aforementioned Star Trek. As we approached the table, with Jessica Lange, I broke my eye contact with Beatrice and glanced over at the older woman I had thought might be this afternoon's dinner companion, and let out a longing sigh. Sure, beauty, sexiness, and all that allure were still pulling me towards Beatrice, even though I wasn't looking there. It was fine, even a little exciting. It spoke directly to my raw animal instinct. I wondered briefly if I would have the time to take her back to my place for an afternoon rendezvous before I had to make an excuse to part ways so I could howl at the moon. But there was something even more appealing, more alluring about the woman who gave off the essence of a librarian. Jessica Lange glanced up at me, and I smiled a tight-lipped grin at her as I passed. "Careful, Tiger," she whispered under her breath, but it was enough for me to hear. "That one will eat you alive." and that clinched it for me. She was observant and perceptive, on top of the other traits I inferred about her. She had intuited a great deal with just visual input. Damn. I would have loved to marvel at the conversation we could have had, even if she wasn't the subject matter expert I had been intending to meet with. When would I ever again meet another woman like that? Jean-Luc was now blocking my view of Beatrice as I continued to follow him. But as we arrived at the table with Beatrice, she was in full view again. Her eyes were still locked on mine, fixated on me, as if we'd never broken eye contact. She was even more ravishing up close. The heightened sexuality and desire spilling off her, which I could now smell, was overpowering. "Michael," she said in a confident and exuberant voice, as if we were long-lost friends rather than meeting for the first time. "Good afternoon, Beatrice," I smiled as I settled into my seat. I had planned on saying it was wonderful to meet her, but that would have made her familial greeting look awkward in front of the maitre d'. Jean-Luc, his hands still clasped in front of him, leaned forward and commanded my attention, as if he was about to share his life philosophy, like the pseudo-Monty Python character his look reminded me of. "Can I interest Monsieur in something from the bar while you look over the menu?" I noticed that Beatrice already had a glass of red wine in front of her. "Oh, yes," she said in a smooth and sensual breath before I could reply. "Do you have the Macallan?" "We do, madame." "Michael will have 2 fingers served neat." "Very well," Jean-Luc nodded. "And a glass of club soda with lime, please," I said. I hadn't been planning on drinking this afternoon. I normally never drink on a day when I'm writing, but again, I didn't want to correct or embarrass my lunch companion. "Anything else for madame or monsieur?" We both shook our heads. "I'll have them both brought over." Jean-Luc nodded his head once more before departing the table. I watched him leave, and then turned back to Beatrice. She was staring intently at me, exuding an intense passion and desire. The combination of that look and the scent transfixed and stunned me. Up close, her beauty was almost mesmerizing. I'd always been intimidated by beautiful people, both men and women, so that was throwing me a bit. I'd been about to ask her how she knew my preferred drink when she spoke. "I bet the maitre d' reminds you of the waiter from that Monty Python movie." She let out a little laugh that was charming and quite sensual. I said, pausing. Yeah, he did." "I love their films," she said, "but Life of Brian is my absolute favorite." "Mine too," I said. Speaking of favorites, how did you know about my favorite scotch?" "Oh," she said, "I read the interview with you in Esquire where you shared your adoration of Rush drummer Neil Peart. You started drinking the same brand of scotch that he preferred after reading about it in one of his travel memoirs." I smiled. "I went out and bought a bottle of that scotch to try it, but I don't like it all that much, I'm afraid. I've never really enjoyed whiskey. I'm more of a wine girl. But I also watched all of Monty Python's movies and television shows. I wasn't as fond of the TV program, but I did like the movies. Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Life of Brian were the best ones. Maybe because they're historical, which reminds me a bit of the antiquarian bookseller in your novels." I nodded, still not saying anything. I was still uncomfortable with the fact that complete strangers knew so much about me. Having been a writer for most of my life, I'd been used to the idea of living in relative poverty and obscurity, but that had all changed in the past several years. First came the money, which started when several of my books had been optioned by different movie and television production studios. The revenue from film and television options was a hearty chunk of change, making my book royalty numbers pale by comparison. But when the option on my novel Print of the Predator was greenlit into a $70 million thriller set to feature Ryan Gosling, and within the space of about 4 weeks a made-for-television film pilot for a series was also greenlit from a different studio, the money became life-changing. Such a deal was an anomaly for a mid-list author like me. My face and name started to appear in publishing industry journals and in the mass appeal entertainment magazines, newspapers, and tabloids. The Esquire magazine feature she was talking about came out just last month as a tie-in for the blockbuster release coming this summer and included photos of me on the set with Ryan Gosling, who admittedly looked a bit like me. A bit like me, only Gosling was far more handsome, far more sexy, far more everything. But it made sense that there would be a basic similarity between us because Gosling was cast to play Maxwell Bronte, the hero of that book series, an antiquities book dealer turned amateur detective. Bronte was, of course, based on me, or at least a fantastical version of me with the same physical traits. Don't judge me on that. Plenty of writers do that, particularly in their first books, and Bronte was the first major novel character I'd created. The Esquire article, and a couple of other ones about you, Beatrice continued, also mentioned how fond you had always been of Spider-Man. I also watched all 3 of the Spider-Man movies starring Tobey Maguire, and even found some of the comic books that I've started reading. I don't like them as much as I love your novels. I can't wait to see the movie. Maybe we can go together. Sexy as this woman was, this was getting far too uncomfortable. She placed her hand on the table midway between us, palm up, leaning in. The look in her eyes was clear that she intended me to put my hand into hers. And I did. What can I say? I might be living in a boisterous, larger-than-life city that never sleeps, but I'm a polite small-town Canadian by birth. Sure, I transplanted myself here in the early 2000s, but some manners and behavior are so deeply ingrained that they don't disappear. As my hand touched hers, she placed her other hand over top of mine, enclosing my right hand between hers and gently stroking the back of my hand with her thumb. Despite the awkwardness of everything about the moment, her touch sent a delicious shiver down my spine that overrode my apprehension. It was an entirely erotic feeling, and it reminded me of how unspeakably long it had been since I'd been with a woman, never mind experienced such a sensual and intimate skin-on-skin touch. "Oh, Michael," she breathed. "I'm so glad to finally meet you. It feels like I've known you forever." There was an uncomfortable silence as I shifted, trying to make room for my growing erection, and at a complete loss of words for what to say in response. Damn it, she can take the meek boy out of the small town, but Hollywood deals, fortune and fame aside, you can't take the small town out of the boy. I took a deep breath as she beamed a radiant smile across the table at me, urging with every fiber in my being to focus on the cerebral, not the physical, not the animal instinct that she was compelling in me. I finally gained enough composure to speak. "I have to admit, you have me at a loss, Beatrice," I said. "You know so much about me, but all I know about you is that you're an expert in the occult." "Oh, that," she said, letting out a giggle, releasing my hand and then picking up her wine. "Listen, Michael, there's something I need to admit. Something I need to come clean about with you." "Come clean?" Just then our waiter arrived with my scotch and glass of club soda. "Have you both now had a chance to look at the menu?" he asked as he set the drinks down in front of me. "Would you like to hear today's specials?" "Not yet," Beatrice replied. "Give us another 5 minutes." "Of course. Take your time," he said, slipping away from our table. Beatrice held her wineglass up. "Now that your drink has arrived, let's have a proper toast." I looked at both glasses. I hadn't planned on drinking, but everything about this moment was completely overwhelming. I grabbed the scotch glass. "A toast," she said, clinking her glass against my tumbler. "To us, to this magical moment, and to the beginning of something truly special." I nodded, again at a loss for words. Yes, I was flattered. Yes, I was turned on by this gorgeous woman. What healthy man wouldn't bask in this fawning attention? But it was also sudden and far too rushed, and completely inappropriate. I decided long ago that I should do my best to avoid physical intimacy, just in case. We were supposed to be meeting so she could share research that I could use in my latest novel. My agent's assistant, Anne, had set this meeting up. I wondered if Anne, who normally would never do such a thing, might have tricked me and tried to use this business meeting as a ruse to set me up with a fan. She knew I was single and had been since I'd known her and her boss. But what Anne didn't know was that part of the reason I hadn't had any sort of intimate relationship with a woman was because of my werewolf affliction. How could I actually be with anyone when, for almost a full week every month, I turned into a 4-legged predatory canine? I'd never been a charmer. Prior to gaining the extrasensory ability to read people's intentions through their scent and their heartbeat, I was never that good at picking up on cues that a woman was into me. But even if I hadn't had supernatural senses, there was no disputing the fact that this woman was beyond just being into me. There was no doubt that sex wasn't just on the table. It was under the table, on the floor, on the counter, in the hallway, up against the wall, wherever and however many times I wanted. That certainly appealed to the underlying animal instinct in me, but It made me extremely uncomfortable, because her obsession and desire for me were unhealthy. I couldn't take advantage of this poor woman's own affliction. Even if this wasn't such a bizarre world moment for me, I wasn't ready to again try being intimate with a woman. I needed to change the subject and get this back on track to why I was here. Before, I said, and my voice cracked on the second syllable. I cleared my throat and started again. Before the waiter arrived, you said something about coming clean? Ah, yes, I was. What was it? Well, she said, I told that nice secretary I'd been talking to that I was an expert in the occult. And I actually don't know anything about the occult. All I know is that I wanted to meet you. I needed to meet you, Michael. So I lied to her about my background, just for the chance to get to meet you in person. I'm not sure, I said, putting my scotch glass back down and then picking up the soda and taking a drink before speaking, partially so I could come up with the words to let her down without being rude about it. How the hell do Hollywood stars deal with this type of thing on an ongoing basis? I'm not sure that having lunch is a good idea. I had been anticipating her response as a scent of disappointment and despair, but I didn't get that at all. Instead, I heard her heart skip a beat and got a whiff of excited anticipation. Oh, Michael, I never expected you to be so forward, but of course I'm into that. I'm so into you. Let's skip lunch. Let's finish these drinks so we can get out of here and... She paused ever so briefly, tilted her head toward me, and gave me an exaggerated wink. Get to really know each other. I'd never had a woman proposition me like that before. At least not that obviously and blatantly. Was all I managed to say. I hadn't been expecting that. I can't wait to show you just how into you I am, she purred. I can't wait to see just how into me you can get. She delivered that last line with another wink. I mean, I saw that bulge in your pants when you approached the table. I've got multiple places we can put it. I took a second and glanced over my shoulder to see if there were hidden cameras around, and if I had blundered my way into one of those candid camera or punked shows. It was, of course, a delay tactic. I had no idea what to do, but I could tell by her scent that Beatrice was genuinely propositioning me. This wasn't a prank. To be completely honest, a part of me was actually tempted, on a level far removed from possibility. The way you might contemplate, ever so briefly, picking up a live wire or pushing your palm onto the glowing red-hot element of a stove. She was one of the most beautiful women I'd ever encountered, and she was into me, no question about it. I was a healthy heterosexual man who hadn't been intimate with a woman in... Well, let's not get into how long it had been, because I'd have to take my shoes and socks off if I wanted to count that high. Even if this didn't work out relationship-wise, I suspected it would be an incredible afternoon that I would never forget. But it wasn't right. And on top of that, if what some might see as my prudish response wasn't enough, I hadn't planned on spending the afternoon rolling in the sheets, but rather rolling page after page through my typewriter to make progress toward my novel's deadline. If anything, I felt a little sorry for Beatrice. Here was a beautiful woman. She was articulate and intelligent. From all external perspectives, I really didn't know anything about her. She seemed to have a lot going on. She could likely have virtually any man she wanted, but she was practically throwing herself at my feet. Like I said, it just wasn't right. She thought she was into me, but she wasn't. She was into my celebrity, this temporary moment of fame I found myself basking in. Having movie and television deals made for my novels, cresting the waves of the New York Times bestseller list, appearing in magazines like Esquire and Men's Journal, and spotted on set with actors like Ryan Gosling and Rachel McAdams. She was into the allure of my current status. Was this what movie stars and rock stars felt like? Never being able to just have a real interaction with people as a person? Always as an icon? How did they get used to it? How did they get past that initial fascination and form real relationships? Yeah, I know, it sounds like I'm full of myself, but you've got to remember I can see through the surface lies and masks that people put up for the world and understand a bit more about the hidden intent behind a person's words and actions via their scent. While I've used it to my advantage in negotiations for my career, I've tried not to use it to personally take advantage of people, especially folks like Beatrice. I could tell that Beatrice would be fine if all we did was go and have wild and passionate sex. She was fine with being used because she was fine with using me at the same time. It would be a mutual benefit experience. I doubted she was looking for a long-term relationship, which was something I couldn't have anyway. She was looking for a fling with a name and a kiss-and-tell story she could share with her social circles for years. As turned on as I was by the visual beauty I beheld across the table, the whole thought of it turned me off. Heck, when I'd walked in here, I'd been ravenous and practically drooling at the smell of food. And when I'd first seen this woman, I'd immediately felt a more animal hunger. But both of those cravings had faded away. I said again. It's a good thing I enjoy striking keys and laying words down on the page, because apparently I'm not all that good at forming them into coherent sentences past my lips. There is, of course, she said, only one question now. What's that? My place or yours? I picked up the soda glass again and drank it down, trying to buy some time to figure out how to explain that she had misunderstood my intent. But I knew I was just avoiding the inevitable, trying to let this woman down as gently as possible. And likely spending the rest of the daylight hours sitting in my apartment alone in front of a keyboard and a blank page, wondering what the hell was wrong with me, all the while waiting for the secret society of manly men to take away my man card. You've been listening to Lover's Moon, a paranormal romantic comedy by Mark Leslie and Julie Strauss. Read by the authors. Lover's Moon is book 5 in the Canadian Werewolf series, published by Stark Publishing and available in print, ebook, and audiobook. The music used in this production, Waltz Primordial by Kevin MacLeod featuring Alexander Nakarada, was licensed via Incomptech.com and is copyrighted by Kevin MacLeod.